Protectionism disguised as fair trade. That's how China calls the European Commission's latest decision on October the 30th to impose additional tariffs as high as 35.3% against Chinese-made EVs. The China Chamber of Commerce to the EU expressed profound disappointment in the decision, viewing it arbitrary, while German carmakers have called it a step backwards for free global trade and thus for prosperity, job preservation and growth in Europe. Meanwhile, French carmakers have welcomed the move. The decision came after 8 rounds of China-EU negotiations failed so far to reach an agreement. Will this help save Europe's ailing car industry? How will China respond? What to expect next? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm joined from Hamburg, Germany by Dominik Pitzke, professor at the Macromedia University of Applied Sciences, also visiting professor at Shanghai International Studies University. From Oslo, Norway, Carl Fay, professor of strategy at BI Norwegian Business School. From Massachusetts, US, Xing Lei, co-host of China EVs and More podcast. And here in the studio, Professor Gong, vice president of the University of International Business and Economics, Israel. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. First of all, details of the latest decision. We are told that starting from October 31st, for the next 5 years, Chinese-made cars, electric cars, specifically BYD, for instance, will be receiving additional tariff of 17%. The brand Geely will be receiving additional 18.8%, and the company SAIC will receive 35.3% additional tariff on top of the 10% that's already there. Other cooperating companies, we'll talk about that, will be subject to a duty of 20.7%, and all other non-cooperating companies will have a duty of 35.3%. First of all, John, let me go to you. How will this work?
Well, what it means is that the European Union is going to impose these additional tariffs on top of the 10% tariff. I mean, these things will be collected when these cars enter the customs. So this is going to be ultimately paid by consumers in Europe. And I think for SAIC, it's probably being hit particularly hard because if you do a very simple calculation, that's about 45% tariffs, and 45% tariff on top of the original price. I think that's going to be a very difficult value proposition for customers. So I think, but having said that, I want to mention that this applies only to electric cars. But probably, I think the one trend as we're seeing, at least here in China, is that these hybrid cars are increasing. Sales of these cars are increasing very fast. So probably there's a way around exporting electric cars. I think all of these companies have very good lineups of hybrid vehicles that can be potentially exported to Europe.
Okay. Yeah, Dominik, let me go to you. What kind of cars specifically will be impacted, and how significant will this be for auto importers and EU consumers?
Yeah, first of all, also the German car industry are importers of Chinese cars through the huge factories in China mainland. So it's directly also affected by the German car industry. Their spokespeople already, there's a controversy going on since yesterday. So also the director of the influential European Economic Institute in Cologne articulated himself against these measures by the EU. So there seems to be a lack of congruency between national interests of the car industry and official EU politics. And as John already said, mostly and directly impacted are the consumers all over the EU.
Carl, help us understand how much more will European importers and consumers pay for Chinese cars? Is it very significant? How would you rate it?
So it is very significant. I would like to point out one thing, though, since I'm based in Oslo, Norway here. We're talking about the EU. A number of you have mentioned that. Actually, it's important to point out that Norway, for example, is not part of the European Union despite being based in Europe. And Norway has decided not to go along with the European Union on this. And in fact, there will not be additional tariffs levied on cars that are being imported to Norway, which, as you know, is the largest, actually has the largest percentage of electric vehicle use of any country in the world, followed by China. And the reason Norway has done that is that they want to accelerate and continue quickly to make this green transition to having mostly only electric vehicles. In fact, from 2025, it will not be legal in Norway to even buy a gas or diesel-based car. We need to have prime focus on a green transition. Also, it really helps to have free competition, to have innovation. And we need to all work together for this. But when it comes to the prices are going to go up substantially, of course, much less than in the US, where you have over 100% additional tariff. And most studies are suggesting that even with these higher tariffs, the Chinese cars will be attractive to European customers, cheaper than European cars. But a point that one of my colleagues mentioned earlier is really important to understand. The German car industry is the largest car industry in Europe, and Germany has voted against these additional tariffs. And one of the key reasons for this is because German car companies themselves are producing a lot of the cars they're selling in Europe, in China, and will be hit with these tariffs as well. In fact, they'll be hit with about 21% tariffs, which is even more than BYD's 17% tariffs. So this is not necessarily something that is helping.
Xing, let's get your take. For instance, how wide is this policy going to be? Is it for all EU countries, including those whose government voted no to the vote on whether or not to impose these duties earlier this year?
Yeah, this is obviously for the EU bloc, the 27 countries that are included, although some of those voted against it. Germany, for example, but it's pretty wide. Going back to the earlier question of the products being affected, it's basically three buckets. It's one, Tesla. Second, the European brands either producing in China or exporting, or the Europeans under, let's say, someone like a Geely Group, Volvo, Polestar. And three, the Chinese brands, EV brands themselves, BYDs, the MGs, and others. It's pretty significant.
So how did they make that calculation? For instance, BYD 17%, Geely 18.8%, and SAIC 35.3%. Xing Lei, I want to stay with you. Do you know the criteria as to how the EU came up with these numbers?
Yeah, so the EU Commission, if you want to get into the details, they published a 200-page document. It's on their website. It goes into excruciatingly details of the investigation that has taken place ever since the announcement that was made in September 2023 that they will consider putting these punitive tariffs in place. But if we look at the companies that are listed, why they're different, you have to look at them individually, the individual specific cases. BYD, Tesla having the lowest, two reasons. One is the investigation found out that they seem to have the lowest subsidization in China. And second, they are producing in Germany already. Okay. And BYD is also relatively lower, is because I think considering they're pretty active in building their plants in Europe, and the contribution already was happening in Hungary. Geely has a huge presence in terms of their operations, R&D throughout Europe. And then you go to the SAIC, I think the MG brand is actually one of the most successful in the European market, but it's totally exported from China. So you look at those cases, there's caveats, there's reasons behind why some of the companies are getting lower. And
So
then plus companies that are cooperating with the investigation, they have a little bit lower rate than ones that have not.
yeah. Well, there's a lot of detail already to unpack there. I hope I will have the time to do that. But let's take a look at China's response. Early this morning, China, basically hours before we started this show, China says it has repeatedly actually pointed out that EU's anti-subsidy investigation on Chinese electric vehicles have many unreasonable and non-compliant aspects, and its protectionist practice of unfair competition. China does not approve of or accept the European Commission's decision to impose extra tariffs on China-made electric vehicles. The China Chamber of Commerce to EU, as I said, they expressed profound disappointment. Zhang, what is China potentially going to do? How strong will China's reaction be?
Well, first of all, I think this is not the end of the story yet. There's still ongoing negotiations with the European Union with respect to another trade dispute remedy called the price undertaking. In other words, the car manufacturers, the exporters of these vehicles, are in the process of negotiating with EU in terms of providing a list of car models and the minimum price they're going to sell in Europe. I mean, this is actually a fairly common practice in anti-dumping
So
cases.
you're saying basically that both sides will continue negotiations on price?
Exactly. They're still, reportedly, it's still under negotiation. Okay,
But will China take other action in reaction?
Right, so this is one
tariffs?
thing. The second thing is that the Chinese government has indeed taken a case to the WTO. In other words, they have filed a complaint, but this is actually a very long process. It's going to go through the dispute settlement process, which may take a year or two.
Right.
And I think probably more importantly, if you look at the legal framework behind this action from European Union, it's actually nothing to do with the WTO at all. I mean, it's based on unilaterally recently approved a new regulation called the Foreign Subsidy Regulation. And in my view, actually, if you look at the writings of this what's called FSR clauses, and it actually differentiates significantly from the WTO with respect to the countervailing and anti-dumping clauses.
So basically, you're saying China is taking a rather measured approach.
I think. Well, I haven't finished yet. I mean, there's a third measure that China has taken, which is, in my view, the Chinese government is probably going to initiate investigation into some French products, brandy, for example. These products. These investigations are still ongoing. And I think, if you look at what's behind all of this, there are French companies and the French government. So I think, the retaliatory measure coming from the Ministry of Commerce in China, it's going to be targeting French products here, selling very well here in China.
Well, some people are actually, you're kind of giving ammunition to some people who actually says China warns against Chinese retaliation, but China obviously does not buy into that kind of logic. Basically, the EU started these protectionist measures in the first place. Dominic, let me go to you. How do you expect China's reaction? You were talking about German producers being wary of what China may take and hitting German industry in the process. What exactly are you expecting China to be doing in terms of reaction in terms of protecting the legitimate interests of Chinese enterprises?
Yeah, so first of all, as already my colleague stated, the negotiations are still going on. The positions are far away from each other. So meanwhile, Valdis Dombrovskis, the Commission of Trade, says this is a proportionate and targeted measure by the EU. The official sides of China say it's profoundly disappointed and they are deeply there's a deep disagreement. So there are two positions, and they still go on negotiation. But China also has enhanced to also impose tariffs on other imported goods by the European Union. As mentioned, brandy, cosmetics, luxury goods from France, fried pork from Spain, also brandy from Portugal. So not high-tech imports like the computer products by the Netherlands, but consumer goods imported by EU. These are also possible ways to impose counter tariffs by China.
Dominic, some people actually already have been highlighting and warning against so-called Chinese retaliation. What do you say about it? As if China fights back, take any action to safeguard its trade interests, it's at fault.
Yeah, I think beyond the surface, so the deeper driving forces and the momentum in this case are not only economic interests. Here the situation seems to be opaque, but geostrategic arguments between the Western world and China and the rising power of Asia. And for the first time, or now it's getting clearer and clearer, is that economic interests and geopolitical and geostrategic interests are not in line anymore, at least seen from a Western perspective.
Carl, what is your expectation of the kind of impacts that this latest policy will have on China-EU trade and probably China-EU relations? Do you expect some dramatic escalation of the frictions between the two sides?
Unfortunately, I do think this is not going to be good for EU-China trade. Understandably, China is going to react in some way. I think it looks like China is going to have a fairly measured reaction, but it's still going to be a significant reaction. We've heard likely there'll be this tax on pork, likely a tax on brandy. And one thing that hasn't been mentioned is there's been a lot of discussion that China may put a tax on large engine cars that are actually maybe even produced in China. And this would hit the German automobile manufacturers quite heavily. But more importantly and fundamentally, the whole world benefits when we have free trade. One country is better at doing something else. Another country is better at focusing on a different product. Also, it's good when we have sort of free and open competition that pushes everyone forward. So it's really disappointing that we're increasingly moving towards this protectionist approach to things. And it's also disappointing to me that the West, which historically have been the big fans of free and open market, are now going against this and putting up barriers themselves. So this will surely not be the end of the story. One good development is that it looked like at first things might end now, but now discussions are going to continue. And there have been these discussions about if there should be a minimum price for cars imported from China to Europe. That is thought to be maybe one solution to this. An interesting thing there is that the Chinese government suggested 35,000 euros as the minimum price. And the response from the European Union was, we're not open to having just one price for all cars. We want small individual prices for each, or different prices for each car model and make, and even to have it different for different countries and where it's going to. And China responded, this is just too difficult to make such a micro plan.
Let me get that in just a moment, if I can, and I'll try. But I think this question is really important and interesting to me. It seems that in the European Union, there's a great divide to this kind of policy. Look, the German car makers are so much against it, but the French have actually welcomed it. Who are on the right side of history? Carl?
I obviously think that the German and the Spanish are, but it's important to look at the recent vote, putting these additional tariffs into place. Actually, there were a huge number of countries that were abstaining in the vote.
Right.
And there were quite a few voting against as well, and some voting for. So there's a really mixed view in the European Union about what one should do. And that gives some hope to me that maybe with time something can be worked out.
Xing Lei, let me come to you. Given the great divide, actually we have the numbers here. 10 countries voted for, 5 countries voted against, and 12 countries abstained on October the 4th when the EU passed a vote to impose punitive actions on Chinese EVs. When you have such a great divide, is it really in the interest of all for the EU to announce the definitive punitive tariffs now?
No, of course not. I mean, the earlier question, I think it's simple to look at. Whoever has the most skin in the game in China would vote against it. And that means Germany and Hungary, right? A number of Chinese OEMs and battery manufacturers are setting up plants in Hungary, right? So those are the countries that have the most interest. Whereas if you look at a country like France or Italy, their automakers, Italians and the French, are not doing so well in China. Although they still have business, they still are working with Chinese partners in other parts of the world. So I think it was clear indication of the interest in place, which directly resulted in who votes against and who votes for.
What about,
and that was pretty clear.
What about the impact of affordable Chinese EVs in Europe for the European domestic manufacturing sector? How big of a factor is that? It seems that we're all looking at who's producing in China, but what about the other way around? Yeah.
I think to give you a sense of what it's like on the ground, so I just came back from the Paris Motor Show a couple of weeks ago. And I think the reality on the ground is that I did see someone like a French automaker, like a Renault. I saw a counterattack of the types of products they're planning to launch at competitive pricing, while at the same time, the Chinese EV brands, let's say for BYD, for example, I was in Germany recently also, and one of their models, the Dolphin, on sale is 34,000 euros. And I mean, it goes back to our earlier questions, how much are they going to go up? I mean, that's already twice what it sells in China. So it's not cheap to begin with. And now I think BYD is someone who will probably eat up the tariffs. So I think that window of opportunity is not so much wide open as we think it is. And I think on the EU Commission's part, the protectionistic measure is to hopefully have the European automakers catch up while that window of opportunity may be closing. So I think this is something very interesting to watch. How much time they have, the 5 years.
They're trying to buy time, 5 years?
Yeah, I think it's the same.
Oh, wow.
Because the discussions are still ongoing. So,
Sure. Well, we don't have much time. Let me just very quickly recast the kind of timeline we have gathered for you of the negotiation. For instance, on October last year, the European Commission initiated the investigation on Chinese EVs. And then this year, on June 22nd, China and EU agreed to start negotiations. On July the 4th, the European Commission announced provisional duties, which started to take effect the next day. And then on September the 20th, the two sides started to negotiate a price commitment solution to the dispute. As I said, after 8 rounds, significant differences still remain. On October the 4th, the EU passed a vote to impose punitive tariffs with 10, 5, and 12, the results I already talked about. China, of course, strongly opposed to the decision. On October 29th, the EU decided to impose the tariffs. So looking ahead, John, what's going to happen? The two sides will continue to negotiate on the so-called price commitment mechanism. How likely are they going to come to an agreement now that the punitive tariffs are in place?
Well, actually, it's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, on one hand, I think minimum price solution is a very sensible solution. It works well for both sides, I think. But on the other hand, actually, it's reported that the European side has some fundamental differences with the Chinese government. For example, it prefers to negotiate with individual car makers, whereas China's position is that Chinese government should be involved in this. So, and there are other differences as well with respect to definitions of subsidies and a whole bunch of other things. So back to your question, it's very difficult to answer. But certainly, my hope is that there got to be a solution working out. Otherwise, this kind of a tariff it's going to lead to escalation, and I don't want to see retaliatory tariffs imposed by Chinese government on French products. But I think the price undertaking, the minimum price solution, is a sensible solution moving forward.
Yeah, Dominic, what is the likelihood of the negotiation coming to an agreement anytime soon?
Well, I'm not sitting at the table, but I think there's still a time frame and a possible way to find a compromise. I think the whole situation is ambiguous. One could say that the EU follows in the step of the US, who imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese car imports. But on the other hand, you could say the EU tariffs are much lower than the US, so there's a big difference. So ambiguously, you could say EU stands on the side of the US, so still part of the transatlantic union, this geostrategic, geopolitical aspect. But on the other hand, of course, it also still follows genuinely European interests. So a situation ambiguous.
Carl, okay, whether or not there is a quick solution to the negotiation, we do not know, but the tariffs are here to stay for 5 years, at least if it is not overrun by the WTO, if the EU is following the WTO directive. But how likely is it that in 5 years' time, the European countries were going to catch up in terms of, electric car production with what China has been doing?
Well, I think 5 years would help the EU companies to catch up.
Are they doing it? Are their incentivization working? That's the question I'm asking.
Well, I personally, again, would vote obviously not for having the tariffs. But we have to acknowledge that China was really quick to get going into the EV area. The Europeans were asleep and now trying to catch up. I think the biggest change that we haven't talked about is probably we're going to see some Chinese companies, setting up factories in Europe, even if these tariffs are dropped as sort of a hedging strategy. But it's important to note that I'm more optimistic that something might be able to be worked out as a solution today compared to, let's say, 4 months ago, because quite a few European countries have switched their view. So let's hope that discussions will continue and that something positive can come out of this. At least both sides are starting to understand each other's views much better through discussion.
Xing Lei, what is your prediction of where things are heading next? Do you think that a quick solution can be found and that, over the next couple of years, maybe Chinese cars will get a fairer treatment in its overseas markets, Western markets I'm talking about?
Yeah, I think the fact that the discussions are ongoing and will continue to going forward is rather positive out of this negative. But my advice and my view would be the Chinese automakers, they should look past this decision now. It's in place. It's enforced today, actually, October 30th. And the next steps are to continue to discuss. I think the chances of getting something agreed upon in the near term is slim, but going forward,
Okay.
I think the Chinese automakers, they have to understand is the trustworthiness of their brands, the
Okay.
service.
That matters.
That's more important.
All right.
Yeah.
We have to leave it there.
And they'll, yeah.
Yeah,
So
we have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Dominic Pitzke, Carl Fei, Xing Lei, and John Gong. And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Luxin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Luxin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got the point.